Welcome to another edition of course MST 014 Ecological Economics. The session that we are going to discuss is on ecosystem services valuation with a focus on pricing of natural resources. The presentation session today will be about understanding the valuation methods and different ways we can assess ecosystem services and valuation of these ecosystem services. Now, when I talk about valuation approaches, we need to keep some certain aspects in mind. The first thing is resource rent, because this is an important part of valuation approach, and this considers provisioning services, especially water provisioning, fish provisioning, different kind of fuel, wood, fodder, etc. Valuation approaches also talk about markets established for regulating these services. For example, the carbon stocks, because these are important regulating ecosystem services. There are also revealed preference method. They are also called as use values, and they can be categorized under different aspects. The first is production function approaches, second is averting behavior, replacement cost, travel cost, hedonic pricing. Now, I will discuss all these methods and approaches in detail in this lecture. Another important aspect of valuation approach is stated preference method, and this especially considers use as well as non-use values. Now, what are use values and what are not use values, that we will also discuss today. Now, there are two important aspects of use values and non-use values, and we value them using contingent valuation method that include willingness to pay as well as willingness to accept approach. Now, what are these? We will be discussing today. Another aspect is choice experiments. Now, this will also be one of the important discussions of this session. Now, when I talk about economic evaluation, one thing is very relevant. We have to talk about total economic value and the concept and in terms of ecosystem. So, what is ecosystem? It's total economic value. So, when I talk about total economic value, it can be segregated into two parts. One is use value and another is non-use value. Now, in between use value and non-use value is a term called option value. Use values can be segregated further to two important types: direct use value and indirect use values, whereas non-use values can be segregated further to existence value and bequest value. We will discuss more about in our discussion today. When we talk about use values, again, as I mentioned, these are of three types: the direct use values, indirect values and option values. So, these direct use values are something that we are directly consuming. They are consumptive values and they can be directly consumed or processed directly. These are the timber, fodder, fuel, NTFPs, meat, medicines, wild foods, so on and so forth. When I talk about indirect use values, these are again something that are called intangible. So, while direct values are tangible, indirect values are mostly intangible and are benefiting us through their indirect support. So, these are, for example, ecological services such as flood control, soil erosion control, regulation of natural and microclimate or climate, water flows, supplies, biogeochemical cycling, climate regulation, etc. The last category of use value is option values. Now, option values can be considered as premium placed on maintaining the resources and landscapes for future possible direct and indirect use values, some of which may not be known now but may be of very relevance in the future. So, basically this is a premium on maintaining in the resources that is required. When I talk about the other value, that is non-use value, one of the very important context is of existence values. Now, what is existence value? So, the intrinsic value of a resource or a landscape that is irrespective of its use, such as cultural, aesthetic, bequest, significance, psychological benefits, these all are discussed under the non-use value terminology. Now, the bequest value refers also to the fact that an individual value having an environmental resource or general environmental quality available to his or her children or grandchildren is of value and experience. So, something that doesn't have value today but maybe have a significant value in future is considered as bequest value. For example, nature and sustainable utilization practices will definitely help our future generation. It is also based on the desires to make current sacrifices to raise the well-being of one's descendants. Now, this is a very important framework and background concept when we talk about sustainability. Bequest value is also value placed on conserving resources for future generations. So, this can be for 30 years, for 60 years and 90 years. So, how we improve the situation from current situation. Now, moving to the methodologies, there are few of the methodologies. For example, the revealed preference method. Now, this revealed preference method can be segregated into three important components. The market price method, that is based on market pricing. Second is the productivity approach, that is based on effect of production. And third is a surrogate market approach. Now, this is based on travel cost or hedonic pricing method. Now, what are these terminologies? I will be discussing all of them. When I talk about the another method, that is cost based method, it talks about replacement cost, cost of providing substitute services and avoiding the damage cost. So, that's basically the cost based method. And the third important one is stated preference method. Now, these stated preference method are the contingent valuation method that are based on conjoint analysis and choice experiments. For example, I asked a community what they are willing to pay if they want to have these resources, or what they are willing to accept if they want to have these services conserved for the future generations as well. Moving to these methods, as I mentioned, there are direct values and there are indirect values. So, direct values are mostly for goods and products because we have a market of certain things. For example, you might find a market for fuel wood, you will also find a market for timber and some of the wild products. So, in that case, we compare the market pricing to come to a conclusion that what this good and product might have a value. Second is indirect value. In this case, the valuation is for ecosystem benefits and services, something that is intangible in nature but has a very important place and very important contribution in running these ecosystem benefits. So, in this case, we use productivity and cost based approaches. This can be effect on production, replacement methods, cost of providing the substitute, cost of avoiding the damage. So, these are different ways how we assess the benefits of direct services through direct values. Now, option values, existence values and direct values, they can be assessed through natural tourism. This is basically a surrogate market, and based on preference approaches, how much a tourist or somebody who is visiting this area would like to pay to have the benefits of these areas. So, again, travel cost method and contingent valuation, that includes willingness to pay and willingness to accept, are used for this particular approach. Now, we move to another approach that is all about market prices. We discussed earlier that market pricing is something, and these are basically used as a valuation approach for mostly tangible benefits, provisioning benefits for something that we have market for. For example, for timber, fuel wood, NTFPs, fungi, then your lichens, something that can get market. So, basically what approach is used, what cost is to buy or sell a good or product. So, in this case, again, willingness to pay, what are choices of people of this area to pay for with a willingness is ensured and assessed and valued through market pricing method. Now, for example, value of NTFP used for villages, that includes biomass flow from forest to nearby villages. So, this can be plant foods, this can be wild meats, this can be fuel and housing, crop consumption. So, they all are calculated with a market price approach, And when we do the total economic value by adding all these different segregated values, we get the total value of NTFPs of the biomass that flows from forest to nearby villages. And that's a very interesting method that you can use if you are studying economic evaluation of tangible benefits or direct use benefits. Now again, like any other methodology, this also have its own set of advantages and limitations. First of all, the use, if primary resource or ecosystem is affected by a commercial market, this will impact the entire process of valuation. Then the second important aspect is that prices, quantities and cost are very easy to obtain. So you have a comparable market to compare the values that you are calculating. Then the method used is based on observed data of actual preferences. This is another important point, and it accepts standard economic technique, the consumer producer surplus based on demand supply curves, and it is very relatively easy than any other economic approach to value ecosystem services. There are also certain seasonal variation and other effects on price that have to be considered. Many ecosystems and goods do not have a market, so in that case it is really tough to find a developed, well-developed market prices and truly reflect the value of that service to the society. So now coming to the second approach, that is productivity method. It talks about the economic contribution of ecosystem to other production and consumption activities. So again, market value is used as an input here. For example, there is flood attenuation benefits from forests. So the value of flood damage to paddy production is used as a value to understand what will be the productivity if there was flood and if there was no flood. So the damage is basically used as a method, a productivity method. And in this case, for example, the net present value of a forest watershed protection benefits are there. For example, I put up a X value. This is multiple thousands and hundreds of lakhs to conserve a certain watershed that protects from flood, that protects from soil erosion. So that damage value of paddy production or any other agriculture produce can be used as an establishment of natural protection or productivity method approach. Now, it also has its own set of advantages and limitations. For example, the methodology is very straightforward, the data requirements are limited, and very relevant data may be readily available to actually assess. So that's a very inexpensive approach to use productivity method, and only resources and services that are marketable can be valued. So that's one of the very important limitation of this productivity method as well. If changes in ecosystem affects market, then the method is going to be more complicated and difficult to apply, because then change in market values have also to be included in this method. If changes are too drastic, again users of ecosystem goods and services may switch to other alternatives. So in that case also, this approach will not be a very meaningful approach to be implemented. So covered this, there is third important approach, and this is travel cost approach, and this talks about how much people spend or use or benefit from using ecosystem services for their recreational, religious, educational or maybe psychological benefits. Now this is a very important approach, and it very much considers the cultural ecosystem benefits of a certain landscape or a ecosystem. And in this case, people are basically implied and willingness to pay is considered. For example, in USA, the value impact of improved environmental quality on freshwater recreation has been considered a very good way to assess and use the approach of travel cost method. And in this case, by seeing how many people and tourists are visiting these freshwater recreation areas, how much cost they are paying to visit these areas to have the benefit, a combined benefit of all freshwater based recreation can be calculated. So in this case, this can be billions of dollars to have these freshwater recreation values and services available to a large number of tourists and customers. Now, travel cost method also has its own share of advantages and limitations. For example, travel cost method is limited to recreational values. So you can use it for protected area valuation or a forest area evaluation or a certain garden or public access place that has psychological, recreational, religious or sacred benefit. The second important aspect is it requires complex statistical analysis. It needs also large and very complex data set. Hence, travel cost method is a very expensive and time consuming approach. Now, when I talk about travel cost method, we also need to consider that it is likely to estimate value of one factor because it is very difficult to separate out effect of different factors, especially landscape beauty and water. So it will be only possible to get one factor that is absolutely or appropriately evaluated, not different factors. So that one factor has to be well understood in advance. Now coming to the another approach and methodology other than what we discussed, this is replacement cost method. Now replacement cost method is applied especially in the areas where the cost of replacing an environmental good or service by a different approach or a different alternative. So in this case, a minimum estimate of money that is saved because of a substitute is used as a replacement cost method. For example, there is this national park, Reem National Park in Cambodia, and here the value of mangrove ecological services, because as you know, mangroves have very significant amount of ecological services. For example, they do cyclone intensity control, they also are very good barriers to flood, they are very good barriers to upstream erosion control. So their storm protection cost, their silt trapping cost is calculated to get an overall understanding about the replacement cost. What happens if a mangrove is replaced, if mangrove is not there, how much of disaster can happen, how much of storm can destroy a certain area or a village that is close to these coastal area, how much silt can come. So with the replacement, having a mangrove and not having a mangrove, how much protection it causes or how much damage it reduces is used as a value for replacement cost. And this is indeed a very significant amount of value and can be a very good approach to consider when you are talking about certain important ecosystem values, values of a forest, values of having a wetland in an urban area. So that all can be assessed through replacement cost method. Now there is certain cost of mitigation to ecosystem degradation as well. For example, the cost of mitigating or averting the effects of the loss of an environmental good or services. So in this case, a minimum estimate of money is saved while mitigating. For example, the value of a watershed or a catchment area protection source for both rural as well as urban water supplies, that includes infrastructure to mitigate erosion, seasonal low water supplies and flooding, can really get a good value to the watershed and catchment area protected scheme. So in this case, how much of the investment costs are there for catchment areas, how much are the recurrent costs, so that can give a value to the total cost of mitigation approach for ecosystem degradation. Now this also includes damaged cost avoided in the entire process. So this is the cost avoided from the destruction of ecosystem. A minimum estimate of money that is saved because of a certain approach that has helped to reduce or avoid the damage. For example, watershed production can help hydropower generation as well as it can also help watershed protection. So if we fail to invest money in watershed management as a component of dam maintenance, so we know that the terms of power revenue will be really high. So in this case, the cost of damage avoided are very important to be considered and can be used through this approach. Now, cost-based method had its own advantage. First is, it's very important and particularly useful for valuing ecosystem services. be it flood reduction, regulation, supporting, and so on and so forth. By simply applying and analyzing and relying on secondary data of benefits of ecosystem services and cost of alternatives, this can be easily evaluated. It is easier to measure cost of producing benefits than the benefits themselves when goods and services are not marked. So that's another important aspect of advantage of cost-based method. It is particularly useful if time and financial resources for the study are limited or where it is not possible to carry out detailed survey. So in this case also, if you have secondary data but you don't have sufficient amount of time for primary surveys, cost-based methods where damage avoided, mitigation avoided, this all can be used under this approach. And then there are also approaches that are less data and resource intensive, whereas data or budget limitations may rule out valuation method that estimate willingness to pay. So that's an important another criteria of this approach. While it has so many advantages, cost-based method has a lot of limitations as well. First of all, it gives you only a rough indicator of economic and ecosystem value. It doesn't give you a real value, and it is really tough to get a real value through this approach. Then replacement cost is often difficult to find perfect replacement of ecosystem. For example, the goods and services, how best they can be replaced. Hence, this valuation also results sometimes to under-evaluate the economic value. Now, when I talk about mitigation measures or expenditures, often local people or people's perception of the effect of ecosystem loss is that they would require to mitigate these effects that are not always matching to those of experts. So in this case also, it will be a limiting case. Now, damage cost method is also estimated to damage avoidance, and this remains mostly a hypothetical case in most cases, because it's very difficult to relate damages or changes in the ecosystem. Maybe we assume something, but it never takes place. So in that case, it will not be a approximate or a real value of damage cost avoidance. Now, next important thing is contingent valuation method. In contingent valuation method, we try to see willingness to pay for or any services, maybe a provisioning service or a cultural service or regulating service, how much amount people would like to pay or people like to accept under the theoretical condition that biodiversity should not be bought or sold. How much is their preference for willingness to pay or accept? Now, it's very important to understand that especially communities who are living in close vicinity of these forests for generations, they find the approach of willingness to pay really not acceptable, because according to them, these forests for generations have been protected by them. So in that case, they prefer to be paid instead of they paying to somebody else for these values. So in that case also, you get to have a willingness to pay or accept approach to do a contingent valuation method. Now, what are the advantages of CV? Now, because this is one of the very important methodologies, the first and most important thing is it's very flexible. It can be used to estimate economic value of about anything, but the best use is to estimate value of goods and services that are easily identifiable and understood by user. For example, they know how much quantity of fodder or fuel wood or NTFP they are extracting, what are the markets, what are the local markets, then national markets. So they have some kind of understanding about this. Now, contingent valuation is also the most widely accepted method for estimating the total economic value, that includes non-use, option and bequest values, and this is the only method to estimate option or existence value. So in this case, you can see that CV or contingent valuation method is one of the very important relevant approaches. CV has been widely used, the contingent valuation method is widely used, and there has been a great amount of research that is available in the domain. So there are a lot of chances to actually improve this methodology that makes results more valid, reliable, and it also helps to understand its strengths and its limitations. So in that case, it's also one of the excellent sources of learning ecosystem valuation. Now when I talk about limitations, contingent valuation really measures willingness to pay. Still sometimes and many times it becomes controversial because, as I mentioned earlier, people are unfamiliar about making choices about ecosystem services. Results that we get from CV are also sometimes very sensitive because of the design of choice, the scenarios, and how survey has been conducted. So psychological aspects are very important approaches or reasons how this becomes very sensitive. Willingness to pay is sensitive to payment vehicle, especially the compensation. There has a strategic bias to influence the outcome. You can easily influence the local person to get the data that you want to have. So in that case, there is always a bias. There is non-response bias also in this case. In many cases, many people, especially jurists, policymakers, economists and others, do not believe very much in the result of CV because it has a lot of biases that can be part of it. Now when I talk about less common methods, hedonic pricing, conjoint analysis and choice experiments are other methods. So when I talk about hedonic pricing, it is basically a premium charged to location in terms as hedonic pricing evaluation model. For example, you have a house that doesn't have greenery and you have a house that is very close to greenery and good amenities. Of course, hedonic pricing will put more choices and options to something that has good ambience, that has good access to nearby railway station, etc. And then in conjoint analysis, we try to do some kind of comparison to come up to see which are the best approaches, which are the best values available, so that based on comparisons we can choose the best offer. When we do choice experiments, again we do a huge number of choosing and comparison between option 1, 2 and 3 and see which option is the best option for us. So with this I come to the end of this session, but what we could discuss was very relevant in this session because we talked about different approaches and methods of valuation. We talked about different advantages and limitations of each and every method, and with a focus on different new terminologies for you, especially hedonic pricing, bequest values, contingent valuation, and so on and so forth. I am sure you learned a lot, and further readings can definitely help you to strengthen this new aspect of ecosystem or economic evaluation of ecosystem services. I am sure this will also give you a good foundation for ecosystem services valuation, and with this I come to the end of this session and looking forward to meet you with another exciting session of Environmental Economics MSD 014. Thank you so much.